we want to hear from a very, very beautiful lady that I met earlier this year. She came to visit us here in Pretoria, Tshwane. Her name is Paulette Teresa Skitzel, and she's amazing. She loves rephrasing, something that she taught me while she's here. She is a doctor at CSUN University, and today she's here to tell us about Juneteenth in the US and what it really means for Americans. Paulette, welcome to the Global Education Exchange Coalition, the Black Mask session. We waiting to hear from you.
Very much, Denise. Thank you to me, and hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, and good evening to our global family. We are indeed not just a community, but a family, no matter what part of the globe we reside in. And I'm really thankful to be here, and I'm going to do my best to talk within 10 minutes. I just did this presentation on our campus yesterday, and it took a little longer than that, but I'm going to zip right through it. I'm here to tell you about Juneteenth, Liberation Day, a day of celebration when the enslaved people from the continent of Africa here in the United States were made free. In order to understand Juneteenth, it's important to know what led up to it as well as what came after it. Very significant things. During that time, back in 1863, in January, the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, wrote what he called an Emancipation Proclamation that made all people who had been enslaved completely free. It's interesting because leading up to that time, the proclamation, as I said, was declared in 1863. However, it wasn't until 1865, 2.5 years later, that a Union general, his name was Gordon Granger, actually went to Galveston, Texas, which is as far west as slaves were being kept, to make the announcement of the emancipation. And so the state of Texas has celebrated this from the beginning. It has always been a celebration in the state of Texas. Our former President Barack Obama, when he was a senator, he introduced legislation proposing that Juneteenth would become a national celebration, but it has not yet happened. So leading up to that time, as I said, our President Lincoln during that time of the enslavement, he really had two things in mind. The first thing he was concerned about was that there were a lot of soldiers dying in the Civil War that was taking place. As many as 750,000 people died in battle or from some sort of illness that they incurred as a result of being in the battle. And that was a big part of our population. During that time, 750,000 would have been 1 out of every 6 or 7 people in the United States. So you can imagine how many people that affected and how it impacted the economy. And speaking of the economy, during the time that Lincoln was president, there was also a group of people from the southern states, 11 states, that succeeded from what had been the United States, or they had succeeded from what was called the Union at that time, to start their own states of confederacy. So they elected a president. His name was Jefferson Davis. And there were 11 states, like I said, that were part of the Confederacy. And then there were 4 additional states that were sort of on the borderline. They were on the fence as to whether they should stay in the Union or leave and go to the Confederacy. And at that time, there were only 31 states in the United States. And so to have 11 or 14 or 15 states kind of go against it was a real problem for Lincoln in order to keep the Union together. And so he did whatever he could to try to win those states back over. He even, in one of his State of the Union addresses, our presidents every January make what is called a State of the Union address before Congress. Lincoln actually said that if the South, the Confederacy, would allow he said if the northern states would allow slavery to be around for another 37 years, which would have been around the turn of the century, 1900, that hopefully the southern states would stay with the Union. But actually, Jefferson Davis said, no, we're not here because of slavery, we're here because we want our separate states. And so we find that Lincoln himself didn't really care about the slaves. He even made some comments about how whites and blacks were very different people. He said that he did not believe that whites and blacks could live together. He believed that whites were superior. He said that blacks were inferior. He said that we were physiologically a different creature. During that time, blacks were considered 3/5 human and the rest animal. So you can imagine the type of attitude that existed within the country during that time. In addition to this, there were some other concerns for getting blacks out of the country. Lincoln met with a committee of what he called the Committee of the Committee of Colored Men. And there were about 16 men that he met with, and these were all freed men. And he asked them if they would be willing to take all freed people and just leave the country, because he did not believe that they should be here. He wanted them to either go to Liberia. How and why Liberia, I still don't know why he chose that country, or to go to Central America. And so I don't know if you have the slides available that I sent you, but I would like to try to pick it up from here to show you a couple of things with the slides that that I've sent to you. Can you tell me if the slides are available? And if not, that's okay, but I'd like to know if they are. Hello.
I'm pulling them up right now, Dr. Paulette.
Thank you, thank you. And as he's pulling them up, I want to say to you, the thing that was so insulting, let alone enslaving any human being, when the Emancipation Proclamation was read by this particular Union soldier, Granger, that I mentioned to you, there was no infrastructure at all for Black people to develop any kind of opportunity for ownership with property. There was no infrastructure for how they would move forward as a people. There was nothing talked about helping them to develop an economic base. And one of the things that I want you to be aware of is that slavery was quite a moneymaker for the Southern plantation owners. Lincoln himself did not own slaves. His family did not believe in it. In fact, Lincoln didn't see the first slave until he was 20 years old. And by the time Lincoln passed away, if we look at what economy is today, he would have been worth about $2 million. Jefferson Davis, on the other hand, who I told you was the president of the Confederacy, when he passed away, he would have been worth $525 to $530 million. Even George Washington, who was the first president, owned 100 slaves. So if you would just rifle through all of these slides until we get to the group of people that we see. There'll be a picture of a group of people. I'm trying to cut down on some of my time from the presentation I made yesterday. Okay, let's stop here. So the slaves were let free. And so here we have a reporter from Chicago, I think it was the Chicago Tribune, went down to Galveston, Texas, and just took this photo. Can you imagine what it must have been like to be told that you were free? In spite of the fact that they had been chattel slaves, meaning not only you would be a slave your whole life, but your children, your children's children, and everyone thereafter would always be a slave. And all of a sudden, you're made free. So what do? Well, that brings me to the other piece of how we have to look at Juneteenth, not only before, but look at Juneteenth in terms of what happened afterwards. Some of the slaves that were set free, they went to other states because a lot of times when young people were born into these families, they were pulled apart from their mothers, they were pulled apart from their brothers and sisters and sold off to another plantation, maybe a few states away. And so at the beginning of the Emancipation Proclamation, when it was read, people decided to try to find other family members. So they walked for hundreds and thousands of miles until they could find families. Some of them actually stayed on the plantations and did their best to survive because they didn't know what else to do, because it was not allowed for you to read or to be educated. In fact, if you were caught doing that, you could be killed. And so here were people who had no sort of means to make it, to do the best that they could. And at the same time, some of the slaves who were now free combined the little resources that they had. Not all slave owners were as mean as others. In some cases, people would make agreements with their slave owners that if they worked so many years and were able to be true to their slave owners, that they would actually be able to be set free. And in some cases that did happen. And when cases like that happened, people were able to get minor, meager work and begin to put their money away. And so after slavery, what happened was that some of the people actually put their resources together. And the first thing they did was to buy land. And typically the first thing that they built on the land was a church, which is why even today, the Black church is a very powerful institution, because it was through the church that people became educated. It was through the Black church that people were able to learn about education in terms of their own history. It was through the church that they were able to get all the information they need and to learn how to live together as a society. So if you would please go to the next slide. So, okay, go one more slide, please. So I talked about the good news, or that they were free, but the bad news is that, as I said before, there was no infrastructure for the people to have any kind of fair labor force, let alone any kind of ownership or able to make a living for themselves. Please keep going. So that was the Reconstruction, the chapters that happened after the emancipation. The first one was the Reconstruction that we just talked about. The second one was called Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a time, and let's go to the next slide. Jim Crow was a time when there were laws that were actually on the books in the United States that said that even though you're free, you do not have the same opportunity as the rest of us whites do. And so during that time, there were things such as public facilities where you were not able, as a Black person, to have the same quality or the same sanitation as a white person. To give you an example, I was born in 1955, which means I was born before the Civil Rights Movement, which happened in 1964. And so as a little person, I had to quickly learn to read colored signs whenever my family would go in public, because wherever you went, you had to be sure you did not go to a white restroom, you did not go to a white drinking fountain, that you did everything to be as demure, to be as respectful to whites as you possibly could. And as I mentioned to the group yesterday, if you were out and about with your family and you all had to go to the restroom and the white restroom was out of order, they take the sign from the white restroom, remove the sign from the colored restroom, and put the sign of the white restroom on the colored restroom. And so you just had to fend for yourselves until you were able to get home. So the Jim Crow era saw a lot of issues around just being able to move through society as a Black person as even lower than a second-class person. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Then the next chapter that we survived, because there are all these chapters that we had to push through as a people, were all the things that came into place to help the Civil Rights Movement to finally become enacted in our nation. And so basically what happened was someone's not getting audio, so I'm not sure what to do for that person. I'm not very techno savvy. But in terms of the Civil Rights Movement, some things that led up to it, there was a reversal of that separate to the board, the Brown versus the Board of Education, so that things became no longer segregated. And it started out in the educational system. Even though there were protests in the South, mostly by whites, segregated education was no longer in existence. Another thing that led up to our Civil Rights Movement was the murder of a 14-year-old boy who was from Chicago, and he went to the South in Mississippi where he visited his cousins for the summer, and he was kidnapped and tortured and murdered. And the thing that was so horrendous about the situation was that there was a lie told by a woman whose husband owned a general store where they sold candy. Emmett Till was this kid's name. He bought a piece of candy for 2 cents, and she made the comment that he whistled at her. She died in 2017. She recanted and said, "I lied," but she never showed remorse. And so during his funeral, his mother decided to make it an open casket. And what was very touching about that is when he was tortured, the people that killed him, they dismembered his face. His face was no longer recognizable. And if you were to Google Emmett Till, you'll see how horrendous the situation was. So this was a big thing that led up to the Civil Rights Movement. The next slide, please. Another thing that led up to it was the Montgomery bus boycott. I had the opportunity to spend a day with Rosa Parks when I was in my early 30s. And she talked a lot about the things that really upset her during that time. One was the death of Emmett Till, and some other things that upset her was this. Most people don't know that the man who drove the bus, who called the police on her, that she and he knew each other. Every day when she would go home, she took this bus, and sometimes the bus driver would be the man who called the police on her the day that she would not give up her seat. And she said to herself, "I will never ride on this man's bus again," because she would see him when the blacks would get off the bus. He would open his window, he would spit onto black people, he would say words that I won't even repeat. And so she felt just completely mortified by the treatment that this man showed. But thank God that this day she said, enough, enough. And in so many ways, people all over the continent that look like us started movements without wanting to be heroes, without wanting to be a movement leader, just by saying enough. Then we had what we call the Nonviolent Student Coordinating Committee. There were students throughout the South that would sit at what we call restaurant counter seating that was there for anyone to sit at. And the students went in a nonviolent way. They would call the police, the students would get beat up, thrown in jail, but the students kept saying, we have a right as human beings to sit at these counters and be fed like any other human being. And eventually, there was an offshoot of this group that started the Black Panthers. But before that, at the Woolworths market in Greensboro, North Carolina, they finally gave in to the students and started serving them food. And then we had the famous March on Washington in 1963 that was led by MLK, and he made his famous I Have a Dream speech. So these are some of the major things that happened afterwards that led up to where we are today as a result of the post-Juneteenth time. Another thing that we went through is where we are today. I have a couple things I want to say about it. I'm going to try to move through this real quickly. Starting in 1866, after emancipation, there was a group of Confederate soldiers from the South who developed a club, and their club was to go out and kill Black people. Their club would start lynching Black people. It developed into what we have all heard of as the Ku Klux Klan today. Today, the Southern Poverty Law Center does research every year of hate groups. There are nearly 1,000 hate groups in the United States of America. Our country, our leadership can never say that we have a moral authority over any other nation when we have this many hate groups in our country. Today, these hate groups would not only try to kill Blacks, but they also kill people who identify as LGBTQ community. They also identify people who are Jewish. I just want to go to the next slide, please, and let you know that the BBC reported that the FBI did a study, and you've seen a lot of recent things happen in this country. And it's because I honestly believe that the FBI is correct. Our white supremacists in this nation have slowly infiltrated throughout the country, to different places around the United States, into police departments in order to intimidate Blacks. One other thing that you may not know about our history, the way police departments started in the United States, in the North, police departments started as a way of addressing prohibition and as a way of addressing what they call prostitution. In the South, police departments started as vigilante groups that went out to pick up runaway slaves and kill them. That is how police departments started in this country. We've all heard about the situation with Mr. George Floyd. Since George Floyd's death, there have been at least 3 Black men found hanging dead in the United States. There has also been a noose that has been hung in Marcus Garvey Park in Harlem, which is a very important park for the Black community in New York and all over our nation. And so through all these chapters that we've gone through, Reconstruction, civil rights, Jim Crow, as well as modern day slavery, we keep rising. And here you see on the left a picture of what happened during the Civil Rights March back in 1960. If you were to color this picture today and update the clothing as of today, it's very similar to what you still see happening on our streets in America. On the right side, there's a photo of Martin Luther King Jr. marching with a group, and I see Mr. Reverend Abernathy there with him and some others. The difference today, instead of mostly Black, I'm telling you something I've never seen in this nation. In areas that are mostly white, in areas that are suburban with no Blacks living there, we're seeing our white brothers and sisters actually protesting about what's happened. Enough is what people are saying. I start out by telling you that there's been a community that has developed, and the community is going on and on. Here you see what has happened as a result of all these things. There have been historical movements since Emancipation Proclamation. Here you see anti-slavery movement, and here are some of the leaders. These are just a few that I could think of. And if you go to the next slide, civil rights leaders. We keep rising for liberation. Religious leaders, we keep rising. Go to the next slide, please. And these are just some of the few people. In the area of academics, we have some major contributors to American society. In the next slide, please. And in the area of the sciences and inventions, we also have had a lot of people. So if we look at Juneteenth, why do we celebrate it? We celebrate it because it's a day of jubilation. In spite of all the things that have happened to us since Reconstruction, and then Jim Crow, civil rights, and then modern day racism, we keep rising. It has always been both a day of remembrance and an opportunity for African Americans, and I will say now for white Americans as well, and everyone else that lives in this country, to honor our collective history, because African American history is American history. And so we celebrate the Black culture as part of that, and the contributions that we've just seen that we've made in the areas of education, the areas of politics, and the areas of entertainment that I'm not even showing you, areas of sports, and there are just so many areas that we've had contributors to this nation to be where we are. So this last slide sort of tells it all. A freed slave, as you saw that photo of all the Blacks marching that day in Texas, this man, Felix Hayward, he said, "We was all walking on golden clouds. Everybody went wild because we was free." Just like that, we was free. And I tell you, family, today, that together, as Lorgie Odd, who was a famous Black feminist, she identified as a lesbian, she was a leader, an activist, and she said, together is how we find our liberation. And so I say that together we will rise to liberation. And I want us to all say that together. Together, we will rise to liberation. Family, together, we will rise to liberation. Again, together, we will rise to liberation. Once more, together, we will rise to liberation. Amen. And thank you, family. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paulette. That was amazing. I love the wealth of knowledge. Thank you for joining us. I also want to say thank you to Azah again. That information, man, is so powerful. We know that knowledge is power. And I think, Azah, you have a comment to connect the information you were sharing with us back to what Dr. Paulette just shared.
Yes, thank you once more. And thank you, history, our history is similar, and our history does not begin with slavery, and for us this side, our history does not begin with white encounter. We have to reimagine ourselves, to say, who were we before all of this, and not define ourselves by these circumstances that dictate that we are forever victims. So one of the things is that we have to imagine beyond the mind of the oppressed. Who are we as a people? We are great people. We come from great people. We are majestic people. From how we are built, it suggests that we are godly, and we have to insist, to go back to that premise, the premise of excellence, so that if that can be inculcated in our struggle will not be, diffused to just, a struggle of, just picking up guns, or, when we are self-actualized, when we reach our intercollectiveness, we will strive to fight a warfare of better understanding and insist to the greatness of the people that we were before all of this interruption. I thank you.
As film reflects oneself and brings back flashbacks of horrific injustice, old memories become resurfaced. The past seems more real than what I spend my time doing. The youth that lost their lives while fighting against racism, the ones that fought for a better tomorrow but could not live that tomorrow. These thoughts in my mind are like a slippery fish in a cold, shallow stream. They turn me into restless waters. It's funny how Black people were made to feel less important and also deprived the right to choice because of their color. It's also sad because in the end, whether Black or white, we all are Homo sapiens. But being a Black person, you were hated for being Black. Reflecting upon this stream of flashbacks makes me realize as a youth how brave and fearless the Black students became because they were tired of being oppressed. These reflections found in our pool of tears reminds us of the lessons of today and yesterday to guide us through the fears of tomorrow. June 16 reminds me about the act of bravery taken by our brothers and sisters. Indeed, Nelson Mandela did not lie when he said, "Our children are our greatest treasure. They are our future. Those who abuse them tear the fabric of our society and weaken our nation." Taking a look into the past breaks my heart apart, but I won't resort to revenge because no one pays evil with evil. Besides, revenge won't bring back the lives lost, the bloodshed. We were all humans until race disconnected us, religion separated us, and wealth classified us. As a youth of today, I seek unity and constant love. I seek to unlabel social stigma. Thank you.
That was amazing. We're, clapping. The digital applause that was felt. Both of those pieces were amazing. Let's give it up for our youth performers. That was
Amanda!
A win.
Word of mouth, word of mouth. I'm gonna switch it up on this one. Yo, tell it famous. Let's get it. Look.